So let's start with the first question. And we do have media folks on here, Ted, as you know. I hope we can get some good write-ups on some perspectives, or you can get some interviews to advance your ideas. But here's the first question. How do you advance the case for having ruminants, and more specifically, producing beef, when we are faced with the headwinds of the various environmental groups stating that methane production is an existential risk to our world? This may appear to be an extreme statement, but these folks get the media attention and the average citizen buys in. So, what other major misconceptions do you see that need to be addressed for the future of Canada agriculture?
Well, let's start, David, with a bit of what I think, and I could be wrong, but I from what I've been reading, I think is a bit of a good news, and that is that I think the tide is beginning to turn a little bit. I'd be very interested to hear what others think about that. But there's been a number of voices that are beginning to bring the science forward in ways that people can understand better. And this is going to make it much more difficult, I think, for the committed anti livestock people, particularly the ones committed to putting us out of business in terms of cattle, because the science is not supporting them the way it was. There's two or three main threads to that, but the one that I think is that's the most difficult for them is that if you look at the total global cattle numbers over fairly long period of time here now, they haven't changed much. They go up and down a little bit, essentially around 1 billion. But you would think if they're the main cause of the methane being jacked up, that you would see much larger cattle numbers globally. And but give or take 100 million of that billion, I mean, these numbers haven't changed much in a long time. And so that's kind of the science piece. But there's been a number of people coming at this very good stuff. And I think everybody on the call pretty much knows or has read or heard of Frank Mittler's work, at UC Davis. And I really think he's been able to pull the threads together of a number of researchers, particularly in North America, because you're tending to get better stuff out of North America than out of Europe. There's a fundamental issue with the Europeans is that they actually don't understand grassland. They think grassland's a pasture, and so a lot of their work tends to be distorted in a way. But the key for me is that, or the way I would define it is that Frank's been able to show us that it's really, when you look at methane as a system, a cycle like everything else, you have to have cattle numbers change to make a difference. The fact is that what's missing is it's not that there's too many cattle. There's too many cattle perhaps in the wrong place. That's one piece, because we haven't been able to make a proper distinction, or as good a distinction in people's minds, that when you're deforesting parts of the Cerrado and the Amazon, that's a very different calculation than when you're putting cattle on natural grassland, which gives off moisture, which essentially ultimately converts the methane in the air to other chemicals, which are far less harmful. So I think we're getting somewhere with that. What we aren't doing well, I think, is we're beginning to learn. We're beginning to learn how to do it, but we're still a ways away from perfection. Is how do we get in the key influencers involved in this discussion? How do we get that information to them? So the world is really driven by people of influence in the media. And we have some good stuff on our own thing. The Guardians of the Grassland for me was a really impressive discussion. They'd only got 15. I think I could be wrong in this, but I looked it up on when I was thinking about some of this stuff about grasslands, and it seems to have about 15,000 views, and on YouTube. but it's a wonderful piece. And the question is, how do you get add 2 more zeros to that? You need a 1.5 million views to begin to drive things. There's another one that if you haven't seen it, you probably, many of your people I'm sure have, but there's a chap in Saskatchewan which has a nice YouTube handle called Quick Dick McDick. And if you haven't seen his beefing around one, I mean, that takes Mittler's work and puts it in the most humorous way possible that everybody can understand. And he's got 60,000 views on his YouTube thing. And so the question is, how can we get 2 more zeros onto his, and then you'd be really making some progress. So the targets we have to go after, we're seeing some good work coming through the major science journals now. They were entirely different, 2 years ago, but they're beginning to support this. I think we need to get to, there's 2 media sources that get quoted the most. One is The Guardian in the UK, which runs stories on this all the time, and they tend to have that leaning towards the European view. And the other one is the New York Times, which gets retreaded and requoted, sometimes cursed at. But the reality is, those are the kinds of, that's where we need to make the progress, because I think the science is on our side. That if you have grasslands, you need cattle on them. They're a system, and ultimately, the more work we can do on reducing methane or cattle that aren't on grass, that's the issue. The better. But the cattle on grass, as long as you got enough grassland, you got no problems. Our problem is not cattle, but shrinking grassland. And that's where we should be putting our focus.
And we might get to that later. Additionally, I think I've heard you say we can't allow journalists and others to talk about averages, global averages, because there are regional differences, right? We've got advantage on our feed efficiency and all sorts of things. So I'd like you to comment on that. And the second thing is, the basis of a lot of these things that are referred to is a flawed report out of California some years ago, and also a UN report. I mean, how do we get journalists and others to quit referring to that work, which is no longer credible?
That has been a real problem, ever since the Long Shadow report. The reality is that people aren't doing their homework. That's the reality. And the other side of this coin is, David, as you said, we get hung with the averages. And they're crazy. In no sense should we be allowing that. I'm surprised that people get away with saying that still. But in the other side of this coin, which is probably more important, is that we're going to run out of food long before we fry here. That's the reality. I've been looking specifically for a CAPI purpose at the net food flows. So in other words, people import and export and they produce, but there's 2 groups in the world really. There's the net food exporters. So those people are surplus in a net sense. Canada is one of 7 major countries that are surplus. And that little group of 7 makes up somewhere between about around 45% of all the surplus food traded in the world. And then there's the other group, and there's five countries that make up about 50% of all the net deficit food flows in the world. And the reality is, Canada is a very low GHG, highly efficient producer. All this talk tends to take us off the game, which is we should be absolutely focused, and the world should want us absolutely focused on producing enough food to stay in that group, along with other countries you can probably guess. The big boy at the moment is Brazil, but some questions about some of the stuff they're producing: the U.S., Australia, Argentina, Canada, and tacked on the end, and New Zealand is another one, and tacked on the end of that is India. And the one thing I worry about is India is in transition from the those seven significant surplus food exporters to a deficit net importer. When that happens, there isn't enough food to make it work, particularly with some of the policy issues that are being advanced today, which is going to make sure there isn't enough. I mean, we can get into that maybe later, but it's absolutely clear on one of the big ones, which affects canola and soybeans. I think most people in the audience probably have figured out what that is, but that you can't turn food into fuel when you have essentially a balance in the world where our stock use ratios are actually declining. So there's nobody can make sense out of that one. It leads you to a good place actually for Ardar, a good place for Alberta in the long run, but a really bad place for a lot of the world.